gonna get started. So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Boyden, and it's my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker for today. At the end of the session, Béné will make a few announcements regarding the general Assemblée Générale at the end. So we'll allocate a few minutes for that. But for now, let me introduce the speaker. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce my former colleague, Ben de Bruyn, who teaches English literature at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. He's the author of 2 books, the most recent of which is the novel and the Multispecies Soundscape, which was published in 2020. He has also co-edited 2 special issues of Textual Practice on planetary memory in contemporary American fiction and on divergent literary explorations of the so-called sacrifice zone. These were published in 2017 and 2023, respectively. In addition, Ben has published multiple standalone articles on writers such as Lucy Ellman and Amwali Serpal, and topics such as animal subplots, climate migration, ecosonic memory, and everyday forms of biodiversity, so a whole range of topics. In today's talk, Ben will try to develop observations from his book on the multi-species soundscape, especially the chapter on citation sounds in military narratives about submarines and sonar operators. Please join me in welcoming Ben de Bruyn.
Okay, so good afternoon. It has been a long week, I imagine, for many of you, so many thanks for being here today. I obviously want to begin by thanking the organizers, Béné in particular, thanking ESLC, thanking all of the presenters. I attended a range of amazing presentations, many of which already talked about the topics that I'm going to talk about today, so many thanks, many interesting references as well. And I look forward to taking a closer look at them as soon as I get back. Before I begin, a couple of sort of practical things. I decided to offer a more panoramic presentation. There won't be 1 case study, but 3 case studies that I will be dealing with more quickly. I hope you won't mind. They started out as a paper on sound, and it turned into a paper on the law, as in the legal world. And finally, I don't really have a written text, this perfectly polished language. I will be sort of talking about my slides, which I hope you won't mind as well. So the title is Homewaters, Sanctuaries and Sensescapes in Blue Anthropocene Fiction. And so the starting point, as Michael kindly explained, is basically a previous project, a book I wrote about the novel and the multi-species soundscape. And in 1 chapter, I won't be reading this out loud, but for those of you who are interested in this previous project, in 1 chapter, I talk about the submarine soundscape. In fact, I take a look at a sort of maligned, politically dubious subgenre of submarine thrillers written by the likes of Tom Clancy, books that are unexpectedly interesting from an eco-critical perspective, because they spend quite a lot of time thinking about the submarine soundscape, the various forms of marine life, in fact, that interfere with the military presence in the oceans, in the submarine world. But so today I will be doing something slightly different, and I want to connect these 2 projects briefly with the help of a poem that some of you will know, I am sure. A poem that refers, on the one hand, to deafening sonar, the topic of this previous project, but this poem also refers to sanctuaries and no-take zones, zones where you are not allowed to fish, and so on, which is the topic of today's presentation. I'm assuming that some of you know this poem, because it also has a very famous line, "Praise your blue humanities," is one of the lines in that. Of course, these days we think praise Béné, but it connects these two projects. So, introduction. I will basically be contextualizing what I'll do today with the help of a broader discussion about, in fact, biodiversity discourse, biodiversity fiction, biodiversity culture, where a range of people, in fact, have said that we need to rethink, reimagine, criticize this discourse because it, in fact, reveals various cultural biases. I'm thinking here, obviously, of the very important work of Ursula Heiser, but also people like Dominic O'Kee, and there are many others, talking about biodiversity discourse. At the same time, we should not just rethink this particular part of contemporary discourse, but also existing conservation strategies, wildlife conservation strategies, because they often, it turns out, are ultimately tied to capitalism and reinforce, promote an opposition between the natural and the human. So a broad background, which I will now try to make a bit more specific before turning to my case studies. More reading, right? So I want to make this broader discussion a bit more specific by talking about the senses, by talking about homes, and ultimately also about the law. First of all, many people have pointed out that the biodiversity crisis is connected to the senses. Most famously, perhaps, there is the problem of noise pollution, but there is also light pollution. There are, in fact, a broad range of anthropogenic sensory crises, only one of which involves sound. Publications by people like David George Haskell, a name we encountered earlier, but also Karen Backer wrote an amazing book on sound and the non-human world, or Ed Young, the first cover here, who sort of pushed me, influenced me in thinking that we should not just be talking about soundscapes, for instance, but about what he calls sensescapes. Various sensory modes are important in this context. Second way in which I want to make this a bit more specific is by taking a look at homes, right? There are people writing on Anthropocene fiction, and they have made a very compelling argument, I think, that in many of these texts, there is a form of homesickness, a critical and interesting, not a naive or predictable, an interesting form of homesickness. And I want to push this a tiny bit in a sort of non-human direction, a non-human form of homesickness. In addition, I was promoting this book to everybody yesterday. In addition, I'm also thinking here of the amazing work of a Belgian philosopher of science, Vincent Desprez, who has written an amazing book, Habiter en oiseau, which has recently been translated into English, in which he basically takes a look at the scientific evidence behind the claim that animals have territories. And she basically points out that the science is very complicated and interesting, and that we need to be careful with that particular way of thinking about non-human homes. Right? It's amazing. And so I want to talk about these homes, specifically, obviously, in the context of the oceanic, of something like Homewaters. Connecting this also to the debate on marine sanctuaries, which is relevant and interesting today, because, as you may know, recently the UN has adopted, but it has not been ratified yet, has adopted what is colloquially known as the High Seas Treaty, or the Global Ocean Treaty, or if you want the real name, the agreement related to marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, the BBNJ for the friends. And the basic idea here is that there is, in fact, a large, as you all know, of course, a large area of the oceans that are beyond the jurisdiction of individual countries. But some of these areas are important in terms of biodiversity, so we may want to protect and manage these areas beyond national jurisdiction. And in fact, this UN agreement includes the plan to expand so-called marine protected areas, but there are many complications. And sometimes people will also talk about large marine protected areas, And that is really not hyperbole, because in fact, this really involves vast, enormous, in fact, areas. So there are many complications, and I briefly, the language is not necessarily very interesting. I briefly want to show two official definitions of marine protected areas. I will not be reading out loud the first one. This is an earlier definition in a document from the US. I want to focus on the more recent version used in this UN document, the BBNJ. Marine protected area means a geographically defined marine area that is designated and managed to achieve specific long-term biological diversity conservation objectives and may allow, where appropriate, sustainable use, provided it is consistent with the conservation objectives. I don't know about you, but when I reach the end of that, I'm slightly worried. And in fact, there are quite a number of people, academics, NGOs, who have pointed out that we really need to be careful with this model, right? In theory, it is great, in fact, that we say, okay, look, areas that are beyond the control of anyone, we are going to manage and protect. But in fact, they can and they have been used in so-called blue economy or blue growth discourse, a set of policy briefs and sort of official documents where people are basically saying, let's use the ocean to fix all of our economic problems. We have a resource problem, the oceans, we have a food problem, the oceans, and so on. And the same is true with these MPAs, because in fact, in specific cases, these areas have been used to push out small-scale sustainable fishing operations, and at the same time to enable much more damaging, of course, forms of deep-sea mining. Right? And so people have argued that ultimately, marine protected areas, it sounds as though we are protecting the oceanic commons, but in fact we are enclosing the oceans. That is what these people say. And so what I want to do today is take a look at 3 books which deal actually, I think, with this debate, but in a way which I hope pushes beyond the official, the narrow, the strictly legal definition of marine protected areas. And I will be calling that, with the help of a term introduced by Vito De Lucia, the heterolegal version of MPAs. Heterolegal, it's a riff on Foucault, heterotopie. In this particular case, the heterolegal version of marine protected areas, which might perhaps be more sustainable, which might fit in with blue decrocs. Okay, so as I promised, 3 texts that promote, I think, the push for marine protected areas and biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction in this more creative sense, by rendering the complex sensescapes, in particular home waters, shaped, damaged by human activity. And some of these case studies, I will show you a map in a minute, some of these case studies also respond to a call by Steve Mentz, familiar to everyone in this room, I imagine, who has recently said that in the blue humanities, we should also talk about different contexts, not just the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And I feel evil for saying that here, but... so two books, I will explain them in a minute. I hope you can see one of them. Hope you can see this sort of blue circle. Is more or less, one part of it is located in Con Dao, which is an archipelago located to the south of Vietnam. The book by Leiline Paul involves an archipelago in the Indian Ocean, which doesn't exist, I think. There are various sort of descriptions which don't match up with an existing, but this is roughly where we are supposed to argue. But so 3 books: The Mountain in the Sea, Pod, and The Nature Book. The first one is a sci-fi narrative about intelligent octopuses, which is cool. with multiple human focalizers in a specific marine sanctuary in Condal. Then there's an animal narrative about traumatized dolphins involving multiple non-human focalizers in the home waters of these creatures in the Indian Ocean. And home waters is a term that is actually used in the book itself. And then finally, I will be taking a look at an avant-garde experimental form of citational writing in which a more or less omniscient perspective is describing various land and seascapes. 3 books: How Oceans Think, Clickstream of Terror, Scenery Endlessly Recycled. These are quotations from these books, and these will be the 3 main sections. So first, How Oceans Think. I'm going to assume that this rings a bell, the title, How Oceans Think, because in fact, rather overtly, this text is sort of reworking, offering a fictional version of existing books which you may be familiar with, by Ian Urbina, and very famously as well, of course, by Eduardo Ko. 3 points about the plot, and then I will briefly summarize more interesting aspects. So it's a fictional version, I think, of existing books. And there are 3 main plot lines. There is a scientist who has written a book called How Oceans Think, not How Forests Think, How Oceans Think. And she's asked to study smart octopuses at a marine sanctuary with a dark political past, owned by a company which is clearly a version of Google or Alphabet or Apple or something along those lines. And these people want to study these smart octopuses because they believe it will basically help them in developing more interesting, more complex forms of artificial intelligence. Second strand, a Japanese man wanting to work for this company is abducted and becomes a slave on board an automated, AI-driven fishing vessel desperately searching for fish because they're sort of gone. And at the end of the book, this fishing vessel will set course for this marine sanctuary. Third strand, this company is challenged by various groups, including the newly powerful, because they're extremely good at AI, Buddhist Republic of Tibet. Sort of a weird version of techno-orientalism happening in the book, which I won't go into in detail. And these people, the Buddhist Republic of Tibet, ultimately take control of the sanctuary at the end, after an episode of interspecies communication, actual interspecies communication, but also brutal interspecies violence. Yeah, lots of stuff happening in the book. It's a bit complicated. Now, this is extra interesting because the writer of this book has actually worked as an officer for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in the US, an organization which has projects specifically in this geopolitically crucial part of the world as well. And so I want to zoom in on 3 aspects of the book before moving on. First, we get a more or less plausible description of what it actually looks like, octopus communication. All right? Specifically, there is one octopus, which is called the shape singer by the human characters, who uses visual signs in an incredibly creative and interesting way. All of these passages directly apply the insights of Eduardo Ko. Interesting as well is that it suggests that in communicating with other species, that needs to happen multimodally. Sound alone is not enough. The visual alone is not enough. It needs to be multimodal. Second, beyond this biosemiotic strand, there is a clear emphasis on the fact that the ocean and marine habitats are threatened, even the Condau Sanctuary. But the book doesn't have to be too critical. There are sort of couple of weird complications in the text. On the one hand, the Anthropocene is to blame for everything. On the other hand, octopuses have always been smart already. Global tech companies are evil. But at the very end, it turns out that the leader of the company is really sad about biodiversity loss and doesn't sleep well at night. And is sort of human as well, right? So, yeah. Sorry, Elon, right? Third interesting thing is, obviously, it delivers a sort of positive, uplifting account of the importance of the intelligence of octopuses, but other forms of life are dismissed. They are not very smart and therefore irrelevant. The same is true, this is not my focus here, but the same is true, by the way, of the AI dimension of the book. There is smart AI, which requires our empathy. There is dumb AI, and we should ignore it. Just a bit with it. But of course, you're thinking, what does octopus communication look like? Right? I will partly explain it in a minute, but will not explain it fully. But there is an extra hint hidden somewhere in this room. For those of you who managed to locate it and to explain the rest of the message, I might buy you a beer afterwards, right? So this is one passage linked to the communication bit, very clearly echoing Eduardo Coe. Symbolic language is arbitrary, but sometimes the iconic connection to something in the real world is visible. And it was clear that the octopus in this particular scene was trying to communicate something negative. The submersible filming the octopus, after all, had invaded its home. And then I recognized it. This is the scientist. What we are looking at is an octopus's garden. It's the barrier of objects the octopus places outside the entrance to its den. The crescent the octopus uses to protect the entrance to its home. The symbol means something like, "Get out of my house." But this sounds a bit rude, sorry, but this is the octopus, it's not, "Get out of my house." The second quotation illustrates the more problematic aspect of the book, where one of the other characters suddenly sees a jellyfish and describes the jellyfish as follows: faces wide-eyed, mouths gaping, shocked to find themselves transformed into nothing more than drifting creatures without will at the mercy of the current. That is hell. To come back as a gelatinous, mindlessly feeding glob of flesh, to drift in the current, meaningless. If you're not able to communicate, why not? Okay, so I'm going to move on now from octopuses to dolphins, basically. Right? So second proper section, I guess, clickstream of terror. So here I will be talking about Leylene Paul's book, and returning and developing some of the things I was trying to work on, I guess, in the book, as well as drawing on Elizabeth Callaway's also amazing book on biodiversity narratives. So this book was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and is sort of the fictionalized version, again, you might say, of various nature documentaries focusing on the oceans, right? Yeah, I probably shouldn't have spent so much time on the plot, but the plot is actually quite complicated in these books. So 3 strands, which is more or less chronological this time, right? So the main character is Aya. She's a young dolphin from a specific community of longy dolphins. And she struggles, she does not really like the annual spinning ceremony that is performed by her pod in remembrance of the Exodus, sort of religious language, obviously. At a certain point, they had to leave their original home water, which was colonized by another tribe or community of dolphins. Right? She also leaves her own pod after accidentally causing the death of her mother. A remora fish attaches itself to her body. I have an illustration in a minute. Attaches itself to her body. She considers that to be unclean, so she leaves the pod to get rid of it. It doesn't work. The mother follows her and gets killed. As a result, she decides to leave her own community. Second step, alone in the ocean, she is brutally raped and subsequently abducted by members of this competing community of dolphins, the Tursiops tribe, where her presence both reinvigorates but also destabilizes power relations inside this other pod. Especially when another outsider, a male dolphin, arrives in this new pod, a male dolphin who is traumatized after a very dangerous suicide mission. He was, in fact, a military dolphin, and his presence will further destabilize this community. But that is actually not the main problem, because in navigating the ocean, these creatures are exposed to various forms of human encroachment, noise, plastic pollution, which is obviously a fundamental problem for these creatures. They also meet many other forms of life, and in that sense, it is a much richer picture of oceanic biodiversity than what you encounter in the Naylor book. Many different creatures, including a whale, a wrasse. I have images in a minute. And all of these creatures have been forced to leave their home, have been forced to migrate because of human noise, human pollution, shipping, and so on. To make matters worse, at the very end, the Tursiops community is brutally slaughtered by humans. I should have inserted a joke or something lighter at this point, perhaps, but here are the illustrations. So basically, Ea is a spinner dolphin. The Tursiops are at least initially the sort of nastier version of the longi. At a certain point, a remora fish attaches itself to the body of one of these dolphins, which is actually something that happens in reality, as you may know. And the wrasse is one of the other creatures that they encounter, a huge, beautiful, biologically very interesting and complicated, hermaphroditic, in fact, fish as well. So many different creatures, not just octopus. The wrasse is beautiful. Okay, so what happens here? As I've already been describing, we get a sort of rich description of the home waters of these various animals. But all of them are disrupted through human activity, which the creatures are unable to fully understand. They interpret this in terms of ghosts or demons. So I guess all of us, this is a congregation of devils, I guess, in a way. Ghostly human activity, including noise, which pushes all of these creatures out of their original homes. So all of them turn into migrants, into refugees, and all of them, very interesting sort of weird aspects of the plot, all of these creatures also use various sort of painkillers. By eating certain foods and so on, they're sort of constantly drugged precisely because of all of this human noise and all of the human violence. The novel, like many other, in fact, stories about whales and dolphins and so on, offers a very detailed account of sound. But in fact, it also stresses many other forms of communication, of messaging, including body language, chemical signaling, beyond sound as well, beyond sound alone. So we get a very complicated sensescape, which sounds promising, but one of the sort of weirder things about that is that despite this complexity, all of these creatures are able to communicate with each other. Right? You need various sort of senses, but everybody is able to talk to each other because there is a lingua franca, old pelagic. Also positive is that it mentions multiple species, non-binary creatures, and non-predatory interactions. The remora and the wrasse, in several scenes, engage with other creatures without necessarily wanting to eat them or being afraid of being eaten by them. Non-predatory interactions, in contrast to Naylor, it's really all about predation. So there is good news, but again, there are a couple of sort of reductive elements. Ultimately, dolphins once again appear as tragic, individual, heroic, anthropomorphic, and yes, ultimately heteronormative figures. There is a male main character, a female male character, and they fall, of course, in. Okay, so I want to give you one sort of slightly more extended passage which demonstrates the crucial role of sound. Ea was focused on the unfamiliar choreography of the Tursiops on the hunt. She clicked in rough Tursiops. Squid here now, follow or lose. She felt the unnatural poise in the water that was another sign of the squid, a wily enough prey to stay still too high. She tipped her head down and sent a very small silent sonar pulse. The image returned clear. A big group of them, hanging without movement in the thick, rising cloud of the deep scattering layer. The larval fish, the copepods, the small crustacea, coming up the water column in the evening rise. Right, Ea thought to Devi, another very important character. One click and the prey would vanish. There they are, there they are. The subdued pulses of the shoal of large squid spread out and camouflaged amidst the cloud of tiny creatures. Above them, the other female members of the group were in position to contain the first attack. Now Ea and Devi accelerated the upward drive, and Ea let out the fast ratcheting pulse of sound beneath them, panicking the squid together. They start eating them, and live squid, after so long, was an instant strength transfusion. Bless. So as I think you can see here, sound functions in various ways. First of all, they talk to each other. They click in rough Tursiops, but they also, of course, use it to navigate, to get a sort of 3D representation of the environment, and they use it as a weapon as well. This fast ratcheting pulse of sound precisely to hunt and kill the squid. Squid, by the way, which do not appear as intelligent communicating creatures in this novel, but as an instant strength transfusion. Prey after all. Yes, and then very briefly, in another passage in the book, there is in fact a couple of scenes which very clearly capture the contrast between beautiful home waters and sort of desecrated home waters, right? As I mentioned earlier, this other group of dolphins basically colonizes, steals, usurps the original home waters of Ea's pod. They colonize them. But at a certain point, she returns to this location, and she imagines that it must be paradise, because this is the mythical homeland, home water, that she is now returning to. But when she arrives, it turns out to be very different. This could not possibly be the same place. This water was filthy, even with streaks of filth she did not recognize, and above all, constant digs. No home. And moving briskly along, third section, scenery endlessly recycled. Here I will turn to this book, Tom Committer's The Nature book, which you may have heard of already, and I will be developing this again with a couple of texts. Very briefly, of course. So the Nature book is interesting because it is, in fact, not original writing at all. It is a sort of collage. He doesn't like the term. It's a sort of collage of existing nature descriptions. And what it basically does is it has a corpus of 300 existing novels in the English language. And what Committer did is he cuts out everything apart from the nature descriptions, and then reorganizes them into a new novel, right? And one of these sections of the book, one of these chapters, seems to be relevant here because it deals with the deep blue sea. And so there are various sort of tensions as you are reading this text between, for instance, the historical and the contemporary. Many of these descriptions are from much older texts, and as Committer explains in the preface, they are no longer true. When you read them now, you realize that nature has significantly changed, right? And this sort of mismatch between the original descriptions and present is a sort of crucial part of what the book is trying to do. And yes, so incidentally, what I also find interesting is that there is not a lot of submarine stuff, which seems to be a sort of recent thing, as you would expect as well. But I found that interesting. So the historical and the contemporary, but also the human and the non-human. Because one of the other interesting tensions in the book is that you cannot get rid of humans. Of course, even if you get rid of all of the human characters, in terms of the imagery, in terms of the emotions, as Comité again says himself, the human is everywhere. And that is partly the point as well. When reading this text, it's also possible to read it in two ways. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. You can read it as a new novel, which is great fun. But you can also try and sort of reconstruct which text am I actually reading here, right? I mean, there are various, for instance, bits that you will recognize, sections from The Waves by Virginia Woolf, sections from Blood Meridian, for instance, in the section on Desert and the Endless Summer, bits from Finnegan's Wake, and so on. And so one of the things that is happening in this book, actually thinking about developing this sort of separate, longer paper, one of the things that is happening here is a form of eco-citational writing. So you cite these things, but clearly pushing them in a direction where the ecological subtext becomes unavoidable. And yes, when you are reading it as a new novel, it's also a really interesting experience in boredom management, right? And in that sense, it becomes a very interesting exercise as well in terms of the human and the non-human in today's world. Okay, so various things happen in this book. I think, as I was already suggesting, one of the things that happens is that it deliberately diminishes the narrative value of the text. It de-narrativizes, which is not a word, it de-narrativizes the medium of the novel, as it were, precisely by injecting so many descriptions, hinting at the fact that routines are much more important than we typically think. Second point, which again involves a word that does not actually exist, it also de-protagonizes characters. There are human, animal figures that emerge and that seem to turn into protagonists. The text immediately pushes back and reduces them again to the landscape, de-protagonizing what appeared to be an interesting figure. In descriptions which, by the way, are very clearly evoking a sort of painterly style. In that sense, the eco-sensorial is again super important. Final thing I want to say before turning to the excerpts is that instead of inviting us to empathize with richly described non-human figures, which seems to be crucial to my other case studies, this text doesn't care about empathy at all. It deliberately, I think, sort of desentimentalizes the non-human world and actually hints at a position that is closer to indifference. Indifference, there are various options that are similar to that indifference, as described by Sargi Dave, who has written a book which basically says, let's abandon entanglement. An alternative is not an ethic of entanglement, but of non-relation, of at least sometimes just leaving folks alone. Sometimes not wanting to get closer to the animals, but leaving them alone. And I think you find something like that in this text as well. Okay, I'm not going to read this because I would like someone in the audience to recognize a very famous text, which is obviously being cited in this excerpt. This is so obvious that no one wants to say this out loud, perhaps. I've quickly added what is originally in Moby Dick before this particular sentence. A monster. And even without supernatural stuff, a monster inspiring fear. That white whale seemed incapable of surge or anger. And as the passage goes on, in fact, again, it turns out this might be a protagonist. This might be Moby Dick, but no. Just a regular whale. Comes up, goes down, incapable of surge or anger. In addition, something that I won't be discussing in a lot of detail today, obviously, there are many, many passages which again emphasize sound, again emphasize the visual in a way that, as I was saying earlier, is very clearly sort of pictorial, painterly in its own way. But important here is also that it paints a picture of a nature where creatures appear, they disappear, they live, they die, and nature seemed indifferent to life itself. Not indifferent in a brutal way, as a sort of version of the sublime, but just indifferent. There were many scenes. Okay, so I want to wrap up and briefly add one extra thing. So as I've tried to show, there are a couple of texts these days, including these three, which I think fit into this push to, in fact, develop more marine protected areas, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, but not in the commercialized sense. And they do that by rendering the complex Sensescapes, the complex Homewaters, which us demons are impacting and destroying. There are three sort of general lessons which I want to underline at the end. First of all, we are all interested in sound, I have the impression, but let's not forget that there are multiple senses. Let's not forget that there are multiple emotions as well, not just care, not just empathy, but other options as well, including people who feel that one way in which we can fight for the environment is to leave it alone, to maintain a respectful distance to a form of otherness that is fascinating, but not necessarily spectacular. Final point, what I've also tried to suggest, something that I've been thinking about myself, is that as eco-critics, it sounds weird to say, but I can do that on stage. We have, I think, developed many valuable, indispensable alliances with people in history, with people in science, but maybe the eco-legal imagination deserves closer attention as well. And in that sense, I want to conclude by referring to two final bits and pieces that I haven't developed fully yet. First of all, the proposal to assign property rights to animals, so that animals can own land. A proposal by the legal scholar Karen Bradshaw, who says that in establishing animal reserves, we did not just create marine sanctuaries where animals could not be hunted, it in fact created a permanent habitat where they could live, creating an implicit property interest for animals in the land. And maybe if we assign them property rights, it becomes more difficult for us to kill wildlife, to trespass on their home waters. Now, in saying that, I imagine that many people are a bit critical of the law, and I can understand that point as well. And that is why I want to also mention Audra Mitchell's amazing work on conservation and extinction, who has drawn attention to an alternative legal tradition, if you will, where, as she explains, the destruction of life forms in various indigenous accounts are seen as symptoms of the breaking of laws, agreements, treaties forged between specific human and other than human communities to ensure their ongoing existence. And so what I was trying to get at with this hetero-legal phrase is to suggest that in thinking about the eco-legal, that does not necessarily mean the official, reductive, unsustainable legal system we are living now. Many, many thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ben, for this very stimulating and thought-provoking talk. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, and we have the mic there, so please raise your hands and be brief. Go ahead, Marco.
Hi, thanks, Ben. That was great. Can you hear me okay?
Great. I guess this is a bit of an obvious question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because you mentioned biodiversity crisis, and if you think about that, if you Google that, you're likely to find a lot of numbers, statistics, scientific models that are quantitative in nature, right? And I was really intrigued by your focus on the senses, but at the same time, I was aware of the limitations of a phenomenological or experiential approach to a topic that can be very abstract and very far from the domain of perception, right? So, especially because you mentioned interdisciplinary alliances at the end, I was wondering if you could say more on how you position this focus on the senses vis-a-vis the numerical nature of scientific knowledge. So is there a possibility of convergence, or do you see them as separate tracks? Where could they meet, or are they not supposed to meet? How do you reconcile? I mean, huge question, I know, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thanks for this very easy question, Marco. God, no, I think there were a couple of ways in which I could respond to that. One of which is that I did not discuss this in great detail, but I think the quantitative approach is difficult as well, because, as people have argued, it's very hard to manage marine protected areas specifically, because these animals don't sit still, right? They move around. So the question of these censuses and sort of quantifying it is occasionally, I think, very difficult as well. I did not mean to suggest that the form of description or modeling that goes on in literature can somehow compete directly with these other forms of knowledge, which are, of course, necessary and important as well. What I think is happening in these books, which may or may not be enough to help these creatures, is to try and show to people that they live in their homes as well. And that the point might be less to experience an unfamiliar phenomenology and more to realize that we should just leave them alone. We are trespassing, as it were, which does not fully answer the question I realize about the quantitative versus the qualitative. And I guess the other thing about that is probably that distant reading type of creative writing tries to integrate a perspective where we are talking about many sites, many narratives, many creatures simultaneously. And that is perhaps closer to the quantitative. But a very good question, folks. Thanks.
There's another question. Yep.
Hello, thank you for your talk. So my question is about the leaving them alone element. I think it's a great idea, but at the same time, I know you questioned entanglement in your talk, but that's very much how I see the world. So I'm wondering, how do we leave them alone? Because of course there are parts where you trespass or where you eat animals, or like these more obvious encounters. But what about I don't know, the emission of CO2 or like plastic pollution and all these things? I think that it gets a bit more difficult, where it's like our existence and the existence of non-human entities are just entangled, so it's not so easy to opt out of that.
Yeah, that is a sort of excellent question, and I guess I agree. I've thought about these things in terms of entanglement as well, and agree that is one way of looking at this. Don't mean to suggest that we need to abandon this completely, but perhaps should think about other things as well. But to answer the question sort of more fundamentally, or to do justice to what Davé is trying to say, I think what she has in mind is not the sort of Karen Barad, Stacey Alaimo version of entanglement on a level of materiality that we do not necessarily perceive ourselves directly. She is certainly not denying that, but what she is suggesting is that as eco-critics, we have a tendency to also on a more personal level, on an individual level, to suggest that the way to engage with these things is to come closer, to care, to get involved, to get face to face, to take pictures, to see, to listen, and so on. And what she is suggesting is, there was this other quotation, it's about being alongside each other rather than face to face. And I find that, especially in the context of the oceans, a very helpful way of thinking about that, also in the context of this book. But I don't mean to suggest that we are not entangled. Excellent question. Thank you.
Right. More questions? Yes, Gina.
Right. Was there somebody with the question there? No. You didn't. Thank you so much for your talk, Bruyn. It was really great. I had to think a lot about the deep sea in the context of your talk, given the fact of the chemical as a part of communication of species contact. Are these, and also on the other hand, the deep sea as a place that is just barely scratched the surface, that we as a scientific community, as critics as well, just barely scratch the surface of. How is this place? So you talked about the deep ocean. How is this place next to the three oceans? And given the multimodal, what is the word? The multimodal sensescapes. How different are they to our intuitive models of these sensescapes? So how different are they? Are they adding towards the chemical? Or are they just with the visual and the hearing? So which senses are included?
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing question. I think, but it's a complicated one. In preparing this talk, I read all sorts of books about light and bioluminescence and amazing stuff. But literature is not doing a lot with it so far. And you sort of slowly see this with the chemical signaling, for instance. You slowly see this emerging in these books. Books which also do not seem to be greatly worried about the sort of the heating of the oceans, for instance. Right? It's still plastic and noise pollution. I imagine that this is going to change. But in terms of bioluminescence and these more sort of, I wasn't able to find a great deal, right? And in fact, I wanted to do a talk at first about the deep sea, reading Julia Armfield and many other books, in fact, which do amazing things with sort of the submarine world. But I was slightly dissatisfied with what was happening in terms of the biosemiotic in some of these texts. And the other thing is that I was increasingly getting worried that all of us are a version of blue growth discourse. And that in fact, in talking about the submarine, we're sort of culturally preparing for the actual economy to move to the deep sea and actually sort of destroy everything. And so I guess a book like this also convinced me to sort of try and withdraw from a world that is amazing, that I also want to, that scares me, and that I also want to sort of slightly steer away from some. And also, maybe one final thing, the other thing which frustrated me with many of these submarine books is they do a lot with the different layers of the ocean and turn it into a crude form of allegory for the unconscious. And I found that very anthropomorphic, to travel to the deepest, to then say dreams and... Sorry, but I completely agree that the chemical signaling has something. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Gina, your turn.
So when on your last slide you were showing the different legal models, including the Audra Mitchell, I was seeing the ways in which that could be consistent with something like Bruno Latour's Politics of Nature, where because that's sort of where my mind goes when I think of what's an alternative legal model to what we have now. However, when he's talking about, but then as you continued and you talked about the disentanglement, I started to wonder whether those were in fact consistent models, given the fact that for him, when he talks about the different kinds of beings presenting themselves to the collective, one of the ways in which, so he first talks about it in terms of speech impediments, when they keep the collective from speaking. But then in terms of actually listening to the needs of the non-human, he does start talking about things like scientific prostheses and using scientific tools and methods to, quote unquote, listen to non-human discourse. And I wonder if that way of thinking about things does in fact make those two ideas incompatible, or whether it would rely in, or whether you could say that to the extent that we leave things alone, they aren't presenting themselves to the collective.
I'm going to be thinking about that question for the next week or so, I think. I'm not sure that I'm able to formulate a very good answer to that right now. It returns to what I was saying at the very beginning. This was actually a paper about sound. But of course, I mean, you need to listen to the material, as it were, and it kept pushing me in this direction, I had the impression. I don't mean to suggest that all of this is somehow perfectly compatible and neat and smoothless and so on. I am aware of the fact that even these two models, the Bradshaw and the Mitchell one, are probably not very compatible. Right? To give you one example, Audra Mitchell will emphasize, for instance, that in this sort of indigenous, and she's thinking of very specific traditions and has studied them rather carefully, this is a legal model, but not one that can be extrapolated. It is laws and treaties and between the human and the non-human in specific locations. To imagine and assume that we can transpose this to a different group with the same model is impossible. It is very site-specific, as it were. And in that sense, it's very different from someone like Bradshaw, who is promoting, I think, a very unusual way of thinking about the law and how that works, even though she shows that there are many precedents for something like this in the existing legal frameworks, but she does remain within a traditional modern framework, to use the sort of historicization of Latour. And I guess one potential way of following up on this particular presentation for me is to try and develop these versions of the eco-legal imagination in different texts. But I completely agree that I need more, but there's a lot of... Nice.
Okay, one more question, then we end.
I want to have the last one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We really enjoyed it. I have a question about the marine protected areas of the definitions that you showed at the beginning. They're very interesting to contrast the US and the UN with their underlying meanings. And I was thinking about how the first one, the US, is more sort of clearly politically and state sovereignty based, and the second tries to be more sort of geographically based, which is not necessarily contradictory, but are clearly addressed in a different way. How do you think how have waived, if you have traced a little bit this distinction between the politics and the sort of the geographical, does that play any role in your readings of the sonic, acoustic, multi-sensory approach?
He was doing too much. He was kind, but he was doing too much. No, I guess this is not immediately a response to what you have in mind. I fear that there are super interesting differences between these definitions, which is ultimately, I think, what you were talking about as well. For instance, things that it's not in this specific excerpt, but for instance, the US definition talks about resources, sort of shamelessly. You will look for that in the UN document and will not find it. Right? They have removed that, even though the mindset is not very different, perhaps. Interestingly, for the UN version, it's not just about protecting and managing, it's about protecting and restoring. Right? So these definitions, and I completely agree with what you're sort of implicitly saying, analyzing this language in these types of documents, the way these things are being framed as a global resource, as a national resource, as a landmark area, which is a monument to the richness of and then the typical biodiversity of the United States and so on is definitely part of the project that I have in mind here. But yeah, excellent question. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Ben. Let's give him another round of applause.